Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, friends of Kubesimplify. Thank you for joining us today at the Docker Best Practices and Future of Docker Cube Twitter space, hosted by Kubesimplify. I am Pawan. I will be your host today. I am a Kubesimplify ambassador and also a developer advocate at robusta.dev. My friend and fellow ambassador Anurag will be co-hosting today's space. He is also going to ask our guest the questions, and also if you are interested in speaking during the Q&A session, request to speak. And we'll start with our guest today. So first we have Bret Fisher, who is a YouTuber, content creator, and he also has his own podcast. We welcome you, Beret. And we also have Nuno here with us. Nuno is a CNCF ambassador, and he is also a tech writer at Rancher Labs. And both of our guests today are Docker Docker captains. So we have the best people to answer all of your Docker questions. Now I'll give it to Anurag to take it from here.
Yep, sure. Thank you, Pawan, for the great introduction. So, hey everyone, my name is Anurag, and I am one of the ambassadors at QSimplify, and we will be talking about Docker today. And I am joined by Brett and Nuno, who are Docker captains. So, they are the best people to answer your questions regarding Docker, anything related to Docker. So, we will be talking about Docker in the starting, and then we will move to Docker images and how you build the image, what are the best practices around it, and then in the end, we will talk about what is the future of Docker regarding from a community perspective as well as from an enterprise perspective. So I think we are good to start. So I think let's start with what is Docker and how it started, how the community evolved, and what is the evolution of Docker over the years. So maybe Brett, you can answer, or Nuna, you want to take it up?
All right. This is Brett. Well, I imagine Nuno and I will be going back and forth because we've live streamed several times together. So we will probably have some fun today. Well, Docker's almost a decade old now, and it wasn't the first product to come out that had the idea of containers or what a container might be. We've actually had decades of other tools, but Docker was the first one that we all understood as mere mortals how to operate, and it was easy to use. It had a lot of features out of the box, a lot of things that it did in Linux that normally you would have to do manually, and it was very tedious and it required expertise. You basically had to work at like Netflix or Google or somebody before Docker to know what containers and how to use containers essentially. And so now today we have a ton of features, and the challenge is now is like we all got to learn it because everyone wants us to use containers. And Docker is still the best way, I think, to run containers locally. And yeah, so we're all just trying to keep up with Docker Desktop. What is new in Kubernetes land? What is new in Docker land? Obviously, these tools are very tightly related. Kubernetes was announced and released at a DockerCon many years ago as just a way to run Docker on many servers all at once with a single command line. So that's really all it was meant to do. And now, of course, today there's 1,000 features in both of these products, and it's hard to keep up. So we're here for you. We're here to answer your questions and maybe read some of the tea leaves, tell you what's next. Basically, a lot of this is open source, so we just go and look at the open source to see what's happening in the PRs and in the repos.
Yeah, so thank you, Brett. And no, I'm here just to listen to you, actually, because you are the source of knowledge. Yeah, so from my standpoint, I started to learn Docker a little bit later on than Brett. Brett was already a legendary captain. So, no, for me, it was more like a bit difficult to get into Docker, actually, because I come from Windows. I'm kind of the Windows guy. And even though I did some system administration before, Solaris zones and everything, I could understand kind of the idea of Docker, what it tried to achieve. But then it was always a bit more difficult to put it in practice actually with Windows. And at the time when I started, there was no WSL, which I talk a little bit later, of course. So yeah, so like Brett said, so Docker is now 10 years almost. It grew up a lot. There's sometimes a misconception about what Docker is and if it's against Kubernetes or something like that. And it's not. Just for reminder, Containerd was created at Docker and then given to the CNCF. So the runtime that everyone uses today is actually a homemade product by the Docker team. So they definitively helped shape the environment and the ecosystem that we have today. So Docker today, and we had a lot of conversation. Maybe Bret, correct me when I'm wrong, but we had a lot of discussions about what is Docker, right? Because Docker had maybe the good idea turned bad in the sense that it was the name of the company and the name of the product. So nowadays, Docker is just not like your command line. Docker is like a full set of tools and tooling that will help you actually to bring your containers locally or in your production. Okay, so we have Docker Hub, we have the Docker Desktop, of course. Now it's the main source, let's say, but Docker Desktop is built on top of other pieces now, right? And the latest one that we will discuss also with Bret maybe later on, it's the Docker extensions. So yeah, so Docker is a bit more just than Docker run in your laptop or desktop.
Love the Docker extensions. Yeah, and I think that's the 2022 thing that we will all talk about is the release of Docker extensions, which is a exclusive feature to Docker Desktop, but it's essentially like you would imagine your VS Code extensions. It's just a bunch of plugins, basically containers running in the background that add usually a GUI interface to your Docker Desktop dashboard. And I didn't really, you were part of the discussions at the beginning of the year. Docker came to the captains and asked us about this extensions idea, and I had a hard time coming up with any good ideas. Like I was just thinking, what, other than maybe a nice visualization of my storage usage or of logs or something, like what else would there be? But we've now got over 20 extensions in the marketplace from all these different companies, and they just released two new ones this week. I think we're up to like 24 or close to that, and they're all actually really good ideas. A lot of them it helps you set up a Kubernetes cluster locally. Some are like network based and help you VPN over the internet to remote machines. Like there's just a whole bunch of different ideas there that I didn't realize would be useful as sort of a point and click solution inside of Docker Desktop. But that's what we got. So if you haven't tried it on your Docker Desktop, go look at the dashboard and click on extensions.
Yeah, definitively. And well, the best one is Epinio, of course, by SUSE, but I might be biased here. So so no, more seriously is like, Bret, you said one thing at one point in time in your when I was in your show that, let's say, I use it now all the time. And there's other tools, one from my company, right? I will not name it because it's a Docker space today, but Docker Desktop, compared to the others, is actually almost IDE for your containers. Okay, so it's really an integrated system environment that will help you from the UI perform a certain like ton of tasks without reaching to the command line if you have to. Okay, the other tools are more configuration oriented, so they will configure the backends that will actually allow you then to run containers also, or Kubernetes or whatever. Did I get that right from you, Bret? I mean, I'm paraphrasing you right there.
Oh yeah, well, okay, yeah, I would agree with that. Because you don't really think of like running Docker Desktop to, you know, VPN to a remote Kubernetes cluster or something like that, right? That's not something we normally would think of doing in Docker, but that's essentially what it's turning into, is this sort of Swiss Army knife. I love to compare it to VS Code because that's kind of what VS Code for a lot of us DevOps people has become. It was started out as a code tool, but now it's becoming this sort of, it's got infrastructure management features in it. VS Code has image scanning, or not image scanning, but code scanning features, security. It's just got a lot of stuff in it that makes it way more useful than just a code editor. And that's the same thing with Docker Desktop, is that it used to be just, you just ran Docker Desktop in order to get Docker Run, right? We just wanted Docker Run and Docker Compose. And now there's, all these other companies. Ironically, some of them were actually at some point maybe a competitor to Docker itself, are actually adding extensions. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I'm quite amazed about, like, yesterday was the Docker All Ends. There's videos, replays on YouTube for the ones who missed it. There's every quarter, I think, there's these All Ends. It's a community heavy community-oriented event done by Docker. It's remote, so everyone is, let's say, welcome, and we try to involve the most of the community around the world. And when I checked yesterday again the marketplace, because they were discussing about like what Brett said, like there was like 2 new extensions lately from Docker, actually directly. I was amazed by the sheer number of extensions. I mean, I worked the host said at the very beginning, I'm tech writer for SUSE, a rancher, and we were actually partners at the very beginning. It was like 5 extensions top, and we were adding hours there. And when yesterday I went, it was like, okay, I'm scrolling now. It's not like massively, like we are not talking about VS Code's right extensions for time being, but seriously, there's a lot of options, and some are oriented system, so purely Docker. Others are oriented more Kubernetes, of course, and others are oriented to fun. There's a Flappy Bird actually extension there. So yeah.
Yep. Thanks for the answer, Brett and Nuno. So Brett and Brett, I think Brett mentioned about Containerd. So Containerd was a part of Docker project, and it was later donated to CNCF, and which is the default runtime with Kubernetes as of now. So would love to hear your perspective on first what is Moby project, which was or which is a part of Docker, and what is Containerd.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's see. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say, who's going to take this one? So the Moby project, Docker is kind of a Docker taking a lot of, ironically, early days with Docker, it was actually turning into a monolith. So we all love to talk about microservices and distributed computing, but Docker itself was this big project, and they needed to start breaking it apart so that other people could reuse some of the open source components. And so one of the attempts at that was creating the Moby project. So if you kind of poke around the open source, you'll kind of notice that a lot of what we think of as Docker today is actually in a repo in GitHub called Moby/Moby. That's just the core of the Docker engine. And then there's all these other components, right? There's the CLI, there's Compose, there's parts of Docker Desktop like VPN Kit and Data Kit, and there's just a bunch of different open source components. But the core of what we think of Docker today is the Docker engine, and that is in the Moby repo. Now, for years, 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years, Docker has slowly been taking pieces of that and turning those pieces into Containerd. So Containerd was announced, I don't know, somewhere around 2017, 2018, something like that. And it was a way for them to take even less of Docker's engine and just the parts of that potential. Basically, at the beginning, it was just running a container, creating a container from an image and starting that container and managing its life cycle. And then they added more features. They added image management, so you could have the image cache in Containerd. And what we're even seeing today, even way years later, is that Docker Containerd is probably going to become the #1 Kubernetes runtime. For the longest, forever, it's been Docker itself, Docker engine. And a few years ago, there was an effort to switch sort of the official defaults for a lot of tools in Kubernetes world to use Containerd because it was leaner. It only had the features that Kubernetes needed, whereas Docker engines has a lot more features mostly for humans at the command line. But Kubernetes doesn't need that from its runtime. It just needs a basic set of features because Kubernetes itself provides a lot of the human interaction through the kube control or kubectl or whichever name you want to use. And so today what we have is we have Containerd as becoming the default standard for running containers, whether you're running them in Kubernetes or Docker Desktop. Containerd is probably going to be the thing underneath. The reality is whether you're using Rancher, like Nuno would want to talk about Rancher, great product, a lot of these different products that are Kubernetes distributions, they're all switching to Containerd as well. So when you think of Containerd, think of it as really just a utility underneath a different tool that you, the human, would use, like Rancher or Kubernetes or like Docker Desktop. And Docker itself is still switching their Docker engine to use more and more of Containerd's code rather than their sort of, I wouldn't say legacy, but their existing code inside of the Docker engine. So we had an announcement this week from Docker that they're creating a beta or essentially a beta feature inside of Docker Desktop to now use more of the Docker features will now not be in a Docker code, they'll be in the Containerd code. You probably are thinking, why do we care? I just want to use Docker run. I don't really want to care about all that. And you don't have to. That's kind of the point. But eventually, what this will allow us to do is have a little bit faster startup time, a little bit more features around building and managing architecture, multi-platform images, which Nuno and I get very excited about because we love to talk about multi-platform. I'm running on an ARM device. I have other devices that are Intel. So we all are essentially in a multi-architecture, multi-platform world now, and we need Docker to have better support for that. In case you didn't know, Docker today, if you just downloaded an image for, let's say, ARM on your machine into the Docker image cache by default, if you tried to download that same image tag, let's say, MySQL, not MySQL, that's a bad example. Let's say Python latest, right? If you download Python latest, your Docker cache today will cache that image, but it's only going to be able to cache one architecture at a time. And so that's a natural limitation of the design from years ago, but Containerd doesn't have that limitation. So that's just one little example, but Docker is slowly moving its feature set over so that we can all have better support for multi-platform images, better support for Containerd itself, and all of its really cool internal features that Containerd is actually getting quite fancy nowadays. So we want Docker to actually take advantage of more of its stuff that it has built in. Most of us don't have to care, but if you really get into this stuff, you just realize that Docker's continually evolving, trying to take advantage of more of the community and more. So did I leave anything out, Nuno?
Yeah, no, it's way more than I could say anyway. But no, right now it's like what I like more in a project perspective, less technical now. It's that Docker understands when there's a standard that they should like continue to use and let's say apply to themselves. So the first one, actually, I have a T-shirt today, which is the DockerCon Copenhagen, which was 2017. That was my first DockerCon, and why I'm speaking about this one, it's because it was the one where Docker announced they will, I would say, embrace, which not really embracing, but they will, let's say, adapt Kubernetes as an orchestrator also, in addition to Docker Swarm that was in a stale mode kind of already there. So everyone in the room was like, oh my God, it's like they making Kubernetes the number one orchestrator. And it was my first DockerCon, so I didn't really get it, right? So fast forward 5 years later, now we have Containerd that was announced like almost casually yesterday, right? So it will also be used by the Docker desktop okay, so Containerd is already used by Docker to run containers, but then all the image caching and the image management, let's say, that Bret was just explaining, especially the multi-arch, was not done yet by Containerd by Docker. Okay, so now by using that, they are getting back, in my view, right? It's just me making my movie here, but in my view, it's like Docker just understanding how much Containerd, when it went, let's say, for the CNCF, but like as a public project, okay, like a community project, grew. And for the ones who know a little bit about nerdctl, which is another command line that allows you to run containers, that is like targeting directly Containerd, they have, this multi-arch, like Bret said, but they also have other capabilities. The one that I like to play a little bit with, it's like the lazy loading, which allows you actually to download an image, run a container, without that all the layers are actually downloaded. It's kind of crazy. I don't know exactly how it works, but it does.
It is crazy.
But it does somehow. And one of the examples is done by Akira Suda on the nerdctl GitHub repo. And there's this huge image Python for ML, I guess. And he runs it like the first time with normal Containerd, but like in a normal mode, let's say. And the other mode is lazy loading using what they call a snapshotter, which is *JZ. This one runs like, I don't know, like 5 to 10 times faster. The same image, just using another dark magic thing. I don't know, it's not dark magic for the ones who understand it. I just don't. I just use it, and it's like it blew my mind, really. And seriously, I truly think that Docker, by embracing now again, a more community based, they are aligning themselves with the current actually, which is more container based. There's Kubernetes, let's say, all the way. So that's the orchestrator. It's based on container D. It uses container D. So I guess that they just make a right move once again.
Yes, could not agree more on this. So Containerd is a fantastic project, and I also use NerdCTL along with Containerd. So for folks who are listening, if you want to get started with NerdCTL, then I think Akiro have written a number of Medium blogs as well. So you can check out his blogs on Medium, and I think he's a core contributor to NerdCTL as well, which is a fantastic project. And for folks who have, I think I mainly switched to Containerd plus NerdCTL because I was having less resource in my system. So for folks who are running, since I get a lot of queries that what should I do, I'm running Docker Desktop as well as Minikube, which slows down the system a lot. So for those people, I think this is a fantastic replacement.
Yeah. So the thing is like Minikube actually introduced some time ago already, but I don't think we are really using it. But introduced the Docker also backend. So you don't need to have a VM anymore. That goes on the side, and also like okay, now it's more from a Windows perspective, right? Docker Desktop really did a huge effort on of bringing like Docker Desktop, or Docker made the effort to bringing Docker Desktop to use the native tooling of the OSs they are. Okay, so for Windows in that case, it's using now WSL2. So before we had like a VM, and I don't want to introduce into VM versus WSL. That's for another maybe space one day. But WSL is like a micro VM, but it's sharing like resources like CPU, memory, and you can have access to the disk and the file system of Windows side. So what Docker did is like instead of continuing with Hyper-V VM, which will okay, it was kind of tiny, but still it will like consume your memory, and then Minikube comes in, and then it creates also a sort of virtual machine potentially. So right now, like you said correctly, is like it's starting to get more and more integrated, all these tools, and that's really a strength of the community because at the end of the day, we have a voice. These tools, they might not be integrated at the very beginning, but if we start like saying like okay, it will be nice to have like Minikube integrated with Docker, Minikube integrated with whatever, right? So then being a public project, right, a community project, they will change also their way and their implementation. Same goes, even though Docker, like Docker Inc. in this case, is a company, they still are way in into listening to the community. Okay, so your voice, believe me, and if you cannot be heard directly to Docker, that's where the captain's project and the Docker leaders enters. Is like we have like another voice inside, and we can relate your messages, right? So we are all in the same, let's say, boat. And believe me when I say like, if you don't like something, then try to tell around you, like find others, and the more you see people having the same issue, the more your voice will be, let's say, important also. But yeah, that's sideways, sorry.
Yep. Thanks, Nuno, for the answer. So
Yep.
moving ahead,
Yeah, just a second. So, for everyone tuning in, we have a pinned tweet right on the top. You can ask your questions there before the Q&A, and during the Q&A, we'll get them answered. If you are learning something, share about it, tag us. And at Kubesimplify, we also have workshops every couple of weeks. So feel free to check them out and also join us on our Discord. And yeah, I'll let you continue, Anurag.
yes, sir. Thanks, Ron. So moving ahead, Nuno or Brett, I think now we should talk about these standards. So when Docker started, Docker was a standalone project, and with time, other vendors or other companies also started building projects around containers, and there comes these standards, these open source standards. So can you give us a brief perspective about what these standards are, like OCI, CRI, and why do we need all these standards? How these are helping other projects? or or the community in general, how these standards are helping the community members?
Yeah, sure. Well, the best part, the sort of the headline of all this, is that regardless of how you build, we had this word containers, and that's not really like there's no copyright on there, or like no one owns that term. Um, and what we think of as containers today is essentially the same idea that Docker built almost a decade ago. So today we have three main standards just for the entire industry, all governed by the OCI. So we have the standard for the image and how it has to look, regardless of what tool makes it. So you got many tools today that can make an image, and they all conform to that standard, as far as I know. And then you have the container itself. So regardless of how you run it in a runtime, like Docker Engine or Containerd or Cryo, there's these runtimes, they all run the container the same way. They all follow the same Linux rules. And then we have the registry. That's the glue in the middle. So regardless of where you store your images or how you pull them in order to run them, that standard for distribution, the registry, is now a standard as well. So whether you're storing them on GitHub or Docker Hub or in a specific cloud or maybe in Harbor on your own data center, like these are all compatible, essentially web storage systems that adhere to a specific API. So the nice thing is you can use all these tools, whether it's Kubernetes, one of the 100 different distributions of Kubernetes, or Podman, or Docker Desktop, or Docker Engine on a Linux server, or run it on ARM versus Intel. Like all these things are basically compatible with the image themselves, the way they're stored in the registry, and then how you run the container. So that's basically what we're talking about. There's lots of other standards, like the Kubernetes API standard that makes sure that all tools that talk to Kubernetes adhere to the same API, but that's very specific to Kubernetes. And so when we think of it as an industry and where all this innovation is coming from, it's around really a lot of those OCI standards. And those are the core level things that you can just build essentially all these other tools on.
Nothing to add.
No notes. I have no notes.
No notes.
Yeah, and the good thing is that these standards are not stopping. So I think there was one project called, if you will go to github.com, reg client / reg client, then there is a tool called regctl, regctl, and this is a standard about how do you interact with your registries, container registries. So this is another project by OCI, which is coming up as a standard to interact with your container registry. So these standards are not stopping, and they are helping the community as well. Because tomorrow, if you want to build a project, you can use the standard interface, which is already developed by OCI, and you can use or you can integrate it within your project. So which is a cool thing.
Yeah, just maybe just one note then. So I'll participate. The registries that since maybe 2019 or so, what they are is like the objects that we can store nowadays. So initially it was really to have only containers, okay, container images. So it will you will publish them in the registry, and you could pull them whenever you are, right? And nowadays the OCI, how do you say? Sorry, my English is missing right now, but the OCI for image paper kind of is like taking care now of other projects and other formats also. So you can start storing maybe images that are, for example, I said 2019 because it was I was part for a little bit for the cloud native application bundles, which are images, container images, but a bit more complex and let's say with other, let's say a stack of images if you want, that will bring you a bundle. And that format needed to be adapted to be OCI compliant. And then on the registry sides, they had to, change a little bit, maybe the structure, so they could also accept all these kind of objects that will start to be updated and stored into the registries. So the registry itself, when you take these standards, one standard is also evolving by itself because the whole ecosystem is also evolving. Before we had only one container, and if you want like a microservice or your application to run on microservices, then you will pull all these kind of containers at the time, but it was like one object stored into the registry. Nowadays, it's a bit more complex, and there you have more and more these bundles actually that start existing, and therefore the registries have also started to adapt to store these kind of objects.
Yes, very true. And for folks who want to get involved or want to take a deeper look to what Nuno said, they can go to, I think, containers slash artifact. If it is I think this is the registry, right, Nuno?
I'll trust you on that. I don't remember, but yeah, I guess there should be like on the containers repo,
Yep.
or yeah, something.
Yes, so there is a artifacts repository on GitHub. I think it is under Open Containers Organization or Containers Organization. So we will let you know in the pinned tweet what the particular repository is if you want to get involved, because this is another standard which is evolving. So apart from container images, you can store, say, your manifest or whatever thing, any blobs or whatever, and later on you can sign that as well, and that will be stored within your registry. So registries are also evolving day by day, so which is really cool.
Yeah, I think Docker Hub, if you look at the Docker roadmap, and maybe that's what we're talking about, but the Docker Hub will hopefully soon, we don't have a timeline, of course, for any of those features, but they'll hopefully soon allow Helm, essentially a Helm push to Docker Hub so that you can store your Helm charts in Docker Hub, which has been a missing feature for a while now, which is technically a OCI artifact, but forever we've wanted to have compose files in Docker Hub so you could share those, and Docker's gone back and forth with various ways on how we could do that, but we don't really have a solid solution for that as well. But if you think about it, if you're versioning your images with the registry and you have all the old versions stored there as different tags, and you have this sort of HTTPS based storage system, why not also keep your other artifacts there, like your versions of your Helm charts and the versions of your compose files and the versions of your customize, right? So I think eventually all the registries and the standards will all sort of follow this OCI artifact standard that's forming, and we'll have a much easier way to download and run things. We've also talked with the Docker Compose team about them being able to run a Docker Compose command that will run a YAML file from the internet, which you can't yet do, even though you can do that with kube control for Kubernetes with their YAML. I don't think we yet have that with Docker Compose. I could be wrong. I don't think that they've added it though. I'm not sure if Nuno remembers different, but I think that was just an idea, not something that actually works yet.
Docker Hub, I'm quite not sure, but I think like for Helm charts, I know there's Artifact Hub that does that, and potentially GitHub. GitHub image repo.
Yeah, the container registry. Yeah.
Yeah, the container register. Thank you. Sorry, might have more artifacts than just pure containers also.
Yeah. Hey, I have a question for you, Nuno. What is, if you had to have one or two tips for people with Docker, do you have a tip or two that you would just throw out there? Like, what are your favorite features or tips to show off for people? Do you have anything like that?
Right. No, I don't. No,
not to put you on the spot,
but you're just throwing me under the bus right now. No, that's cool. No, I would say Docker, like how I started, maybe I would say like that. Start small. Don't try to actually understand the whole thing right away. Like when you talk about like building images, we already spoke like different times, like multi-arch. Then you have the multi-stage builds also there. Then the Docker Compose and everything. So when you get to Docker, like the first time, try to understand really the basis, like what we are discussing until now, right? Like, what is an image? How can I interact with it? How do I build a simple image, right? Then grow from there. Okay, I see several times, even at my workplace, let's say, new people to containers, and they read something on the internet and they just want to mimic it right away. And I'm like, okay, but do you understand what you're trying to do? And most of the cases like, no, I just read that, right? So try to really get to Docker, understand like where you are. For example, from Windows, one thing that it's stupid, but we don't get it. We are always speaking about like Docker this and Docker that. Docker images are still bound to an OS, for example. Okay, so when you are on Windows, you can run Windows containers also. Okay, but let's say you can run Windows containers. Now, if you go to Linux and you read something and you try to run a Linux container, a Windows container on Linux, it will fail simply because both architectures are not the same. Now, like I said, try to understand. So Mac OS is a bit more, let's say, easy and complex at the same time because you can run Linux containers, not Windows, but Linux containers. You run it. That's the, let's say, that's what you do. But you don't have, or correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have like Mac containers nowadays, correct?
Yeah, that's the one that's still missing. Yeah, Apple hasn't created the things they need inside the Mac kernel in order to basically have feature parity with what we have in Linux and Windows kernels. So it's unfortunate, but we still got Docker Desktop.
Exactly. So then containers, even though you have like a simile OS inside, it's still like sharing a lot of let's say resources of your main host. Okay, and it's somewhat limited here and there. Okay, we can now add systemd, for example, to containers, but that's not, let's say, what you do normally. So your applications, when you start building them, you also need to take its what we call like a sane base image, potentially the first time, and the more you will grow, the more you will understand it. First, we'll maybe take something like everyone knows, like everyone. I'm doing air quotes right now, but you will take like Ubuntu, for example. And down the line, you will see that almost everyone is using Alpine. And nowadays, everyone is trying to switch to distro-less containers, actually, even. But this path, right, when you read it, okay, for the people who are working with Docker, seems like, oh, okay, I go distro-less, makes sense. But you don't know when you start everything that it demands. So start small, start like by understanding really the basics and then grow. That's, let's say, the learning aspect. And buy Bret's courses because they're the best. That's free. That's on me, Bret. Um, and technically speaking, I don't know. You have way more experience there for what you do, but I would say just one thing: it's easy when you test. Like, let's say, when you run a container or an image, you will do a Docker run, put the image name, don't bother with a tag, and then run it, kind of. So tags are here to help you to reproduce exactly, okay, in various systems or various stages of your deployment, to ensure that you are exactly pointing at something, okay, that is precise, which is a tag. Okay, so latest, it's cool, but it's not a way to go. Believe me, I know putting tags might be tedious. You need to find it, you need to remember it, and you need to type it. But believe me, once you have it done and written, you can literally now reproduce exactly the same, let's say, run of your container on various systems. And that's really, really important. And you, Bret, what's your tips?
Well, thanks for mentioning the courses. Yes, I do. I do spend a lot of my time on my courses. And I don't know, I guess two things that I'm always excited to tell people, and then they often don't know about them yet because they are still relatively new and unheard of, is if you're using Docker Compose, which is my favorite tool of all the Docker tools. Docker Compose is absolutely the one I use the most. I use it every day when I'm spinning up and down projects. And if you're still using it with Docker dash compose at the command line, take out the dash and put in a space. So make it Docker space compose, which is a whole new rebuilt version of Compose called Compose v2. And it's now built in as a plugin to Docker rather than a separate binary that's actually Python, which is the older version. So just think, don't put in a dash, put in a space. You'll get new features. It automatically uses build kit to build faster. All the commands are faster. It's just great. I mean, it's basically the thing that we're all using now. So if you didn't know about that, now you know. The second thing, I guess, would be, gosh, it's like at least 4 or 5 years old now. But if you change the environment variable Docker underscore host, if you change that to be a remote server, you can use SSH. So as long as you have SSH to another server, another Linux machine, that has Docker engine running on it, you can run your local Docker command line against that server without exposing any additional ports. And the way you do that is through SSH : basically the standard SSH URL. So SSH : / user at server name or whatever. And you can use something also called Docker context, which allows you to save those settings. But the easier way to do it, if you don't want to learn about Docker context, which is similar to kube control context, is to just use the Docker environment variable Docker underscore host. And you can set that to any other server as long as you have SSH access. And if that machine is running Docker, you don't have to live in SSH anymore. You can just run your local Docker command line, use your local Docker source code for all your apps, and then just use a remote machine, and it acts like it's local. You're just using the same Docker command. So those would maybe be my most popular tips, and I share them often. So it's not like I came up with anything new.
Okay, let me help quickly. That works on Windows too. So long time ago, there was only WSL1. WSL1 is like a translation layer kind of, and I would actually target via SSH the Docker running on MobiVM at the time. The context, second joke here, the context, if you are also on Windows, sorry, now I'm all motivated. Thank you, Bret. So what you can do is like you can run the two daemons at the same time. Okay, I blogged 3 times about it. I will let you find my blogs, but it's like you can run the Linux running on WSL2, and with the context, somehow you can also actually start the Windows context, so you don't have to switch back and forth. There's some limitations. It's not there on purpose right now, but you still can do it. And Docker context, that's true. That's one of the commands that I really, really liked. And SSH, just to, let's say, to make it like why it's so important, like SSH is everywhere on Windows, on Linux, on Mac. Okay, it's like it's a default secured protocol for communication between, let's say, endpoints, right? So at the time before SSH, we had to create certificates to set your HTTPS connectivity, TLS, right? Between your Docker client and the Docker daemon. And I tried it out. It took me like 3 posts or 3 blogs, a series of 3 blogs, to get everything explained and everything. SSH, you just like Docker host, like Bret said, and then SSH : / name of your machine, and you there. And believe me, like the time gain between a TLS installation configuration and an SSH one, it's like there's no comparison. It's so much faster and also way more simpler to implement.
That's really cool. Thanks for that. That's cool.
Okay. So since Saiyam is here on this, Saiyam, you want to ask something, or if not, then let us know your 2 cool features about Docker.
So one thing real quick, one of the topics I think for this was the future of Docker. And Nuno and I think a lot of our time spent in the captain's chat is all about like the next features, the new features. Nuno, did you want to mention some of the things? I think we kind of mentioned it before, but did you want to mention some of the things they announced yesterday at the all hands?
So, okay, there was extension, but it was already done. And then there's really, I think the main one, like we discussed already, but it was really all the containerd runtime being now like incorporated into Docker. Just in timelines, because it was said, I don't know if it was said during the normal one, the main stage, or during the French actually stage, but the idea is to get like testing by the community, so it's out there. You can download it. Docker Desktop 4.12.0. You will have the possibility to have in the how do you say, the experimental features. You will have containerd for image management, and that one will be until the end of the year. and in testing, okay, back and forth, ironing bugs, and then finally maybe next year, early next year, that's when it will come out. But that's one definitively that they announced. Like Containerd for me, it was like the major one. Do you have another one, Brett?
Yeah, the Containerd is pretty cool. I'm excited that we're going to be able to store multiple architectures of the same image tag, which I think that's one of the features they're focusing on for BuildKit and Containerd. But that's something that I specifically have wanted, and I've had to essentially retag everything if I wanted to keep multiple local builds. But obviously, more Docker desktop extensions. We just had one of my favorites, which was actually, I think, based upon an idea I had called Docker Backup, or I actually named it Backup, which was the idea for volume backups on your local machine. So if you put stuff in volumes, maybe you put in a sample database or something, and you wanted to just keep a copy of that, Docker didn't really have an easy way for you to export volumes or import them. We can do it for images. We just didn't really have an easy tool to do it for volumes. So I created a simple little shell script with some help from the community, and we called it Backup, and it just basically ran a couple of Docker commands to copy a volume in and out of an image that is basically a scratch image or a blank image, or almost scratch. It had a couple of little utilities in it, but we would do that, and that would allow you to move the volume around. You could export it, import it, put it to a registry. Well, Docker got inspired by that, and they created, they spent 3 months now, and they've created a Docker extension called Backup and Share. So go check out the extension. It's a brand new one. If you have to have the latest version, so make sure you update your Docker desktop. And there's now this GUI that will let you back up, restore, copy, clone, push and pull volumes essentially inside an image, but the tool itself makes it a little transparent. Really have to worry about the fact that it's in an image. And I'm really curious if people will use that, if that's helpful, if that's something that your team might use to maybe like have a sample database or some sample artifacts that aren't really stored in Git, and you maybe need to copy them around between team members. I do get those requests in my courses sometimes. Is how do I store a database in a volume in case it's just a sample database that I want my developers to start from, when they've got a new setup or something. So that's how this all got started. But that just released this week or last week, so that's pretty exciting. The last one there I'll say is I think what we're expecting to see is more investment, like we keep seeing, more investment in the Docker desktop dashboard. So expect that to have more extensions, more features built in. Some of the stuff in the roadmap includes support for dynamically mounting volumes, editing environment variables, exposing ports, basically doing all the things you can do at the command line on a normal day-to-day Docker workflow, to do that in the GUI, including more compose stuff. So like I think they just added the feature to be able to stop or something in compose within the GUI. So we're going to be getting more and more of those GUI features so that we don't have to go back to the command line if we don't want to. Maybe because we're already in VS Code or another IDE and we don't want to have to jump to the command line for Docker. So I think that's not really, there's nothing secret about those ideas because they're all in the roadmap. So I feel like I'm just reading from GitHub, but that's a few.
That's okay. I will not sell you out and get you out of captains. No, about extension. Okay, you might start hearing us like talking a lot more about extensions because I guess again I will reiterate what I said before, but it really helps you not getting into the command line, which is sometimes bad, but let's say could be useful. And like this one, like the backup and share extension, then suddenly really makes sense and add something actually to something maybe difficult to do manually by yourself. Another one that it's really small but has a lot of potential, especially for the let's say the more constrained configurations out there. It's the disk usage. So it doesn't say much. It just tells you like about how much build cache, amount images you have, and then you just have a button called reclaim space or reclaimable space, and you just click it and it will delete everything that it's not in use. Stop containers, images that are not used maybe since I don't know how much time. So it's something that can really be, again, be careful, but if it's on your laptop, I mean, you can always reclaim some giga or gigabits of space, and that's always welcome.
Yeah, I'll mention real quick that I'm going to do a shameless plug. that I just updated my Docker Mastery course. So if any of you are wanting to take a Docker course, just go to my Twitter profile. You can click the link. It'll send you eventually to the course coupons on my website, so you can get those courses really cheap. But we just spent the last couple of months updating all the install videos to because we've got Docker Desktop Dashboard and the extensions and all this stuff. I needed to refresh those videos. So there's like 9 new videos in there just on getting Docker, Kubernetes, and all the other tools you need set up on your local machine. And I do that specifically for Mac, Windows with now WSL2, and also Linux, because Linux Desktop now gets Docker Desktop for Linux. So and then of course there's the server engine if you want to run Docker on a server, and that's in there as well. So just a little plug.
And Windows, Docker Windows, like Windows containers, not just Docker Desktop for Windows, right?
Yeah.
I learned through you and Elton, so please assume that you are a Windows lover, please. Docker Desktop for Linux, that was one thing that we really wanted for some time. And I'm a Windows guy, but again, I always have this special place for in my heart for Linux. And the time, and it's still in beta, kind of, so please download, test it. The installation, I will be totally frank here, it's still not so, let's say, it's friendly without being friendly. So try it out. If you have any problems or issues, please don't hesitate to tag us on Twitter mainly, or in Bret's Discord channel also. Again, second plug. You will owe me big, Bret.
I'm already in your debt, sir.
So try really desktop. If you have a Linux desktop, try Docker Desktop there. There's actually I saw it today, but there's like now 3 packages formats, which is deb rpm, of course, but then also the arch format, which is actually quite cool. So try it out. If you face any issues, I'm curious. I installed it right now on Pop! OS. I installed it also on OpenSUSE. It's working, so I'm confident there. But again, the experience sometimes is a bit hacky. So try it out. But the point, and that might be a question that I will send it to you now. So that was my time now to ask you a question. But what is then the idea behind Docker Desktop for Linux? Because Docker was on Linux already. So what was the idea behind? Bret?
The idea behind putting it on desktop?
Yeah, the Docker Desktop on Linux, yeah. Sorry, it's a curveball.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that's maybe not obvious about that, to kind of answer your question, is that if you, unlike putting Docker Engine on Linux, like we've all done, I mean, that was the first thing they released, right? Was the Linux version. And we've all done that from apt or yum or whatever our package manager is for almost a decade now. And now that we have Docker Desktop for Linux, they actually install it differently. So you can run both of these in parallel, which is kind of interesting. So they didn't change the way that Docker Engine or Docker command line is installed, but what they added was more apt and yum packages that will give you a different Docker install inside of a VM, like we do for Mac and Windows, inside of a little tiny VM in Linux desktop. So some people might wonder, like, why would Docker do that if you can just run Docker Engine directly on the host OS and use the host OS kernel? Well, lots of reasons. One was Docker wanted the Linux users, the Linux desktop users, to have the exact same experience as us Mac and Windows people. So that was requirement one, was to make it the same, which is run it inside a VM that Docker controls so they can update it and keep it secure. And then the second thing was they didn't want to affect your other Docker install, your Docker engine that you might be running on the host. So when they install it, it runs in its own context. We mentioned context earlier. So it's a different Docker context that allows you to run either the VM-based Docker desktop, or if you want, you can still install the Docker engine and CLI on the host OS, and it can share those. It basically doesn't conflict. So you can still run the old and new ways. I love it just specifically because whenever I want to nuke my whole container setup, right? I got too many images, I got too many containers, maybe I've got a bug or something that I can't work out on Docker desktop. You can just reset it. It wipes the VM, cleans out everything, shrinks it down to the tiny original size. And I like to do that sometimes just because my whole environment gets all messed up. I got too much stuff, and instead of running prune commands and all that stuff, I'd rather just reset. So that's cool that you can now do that on Docker Desktop for Linux, the same way you can do that on Mac and Windows. And that's kind of one of the reasons I like using Docker Desktop on Linux versus the old way on Linux, because it gives me that reset button that's much easier to use.
Nice, thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Brett and Nuno. And folks, if you have any question now, you can request for speakers, and I will add you, and you can ask your questions directly to Nuno and or Brett. And now, since I think you are able to unmute. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kunal. Sorry, Anurag, for hosting the space, and thanks to Brett and Nuno for dropping the awesome knowledge that they always do. So yeah, uh, like you all know, Brett, he has been in the container industry for a long, long time. Great courses. He also has a YouTube channel, so do make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and buy the course because he regularly updates his Docker mastery course, which is really awesome. So go check that out. And Nuno is the WSL master. I did the WSL series starting with him with introduction to WSL. So anything related to WSL, just give a shout to Nuno. He'll be happy to help because that's what these people do, right? They are so very willing to help people getting started with Docker in the right way, and amazing tips given by Brett on Compose. That's something that many people do not know. Like, do not use the hyphen, and you'll get a whole new set of stuff with the Compose that you can do. That's amazing. And since they are the captains, so they do work very closely with the Docker team in defining the roadmap, in checking out the existing features or the cool stuff which will be going out next. So I think this space really did drop a lot of knowledge in terms of what is coming up next. So many people, when the Docker shim stuff was started, started to think, Docker is dead, and so on and so forth, but it's not. There are many more aspects to it, so it has like many more branches from where they will be like accelerating and even helping the extensions, like v cluster extension, the slim ai extension, the docker s bomb command. So you can see, like, in terms of how it is getting matured, and a lot of stuff, new things are getting added with every release, and it's becoming cooler and cooler, I believe. So yeah, thanks Brett and Nuno for hopping in, and if anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to ask. And yeah, if you have anything to plug in, please do that. Make sure to follow Nuno and Brett on Twitter as well, on YouTube's, and their courses, not because they're on the space, but because they're actually good. So you should definitely check those out. And I think, let me just check the question sections if any are there.
Yeah, I see a couple in there. One
Yeah.
around Dr. Slim. That's a great topic. I'm not sure we have the time today to completely talk about it, but if you check out my YouTube channel, I recently just did a whole episode with the Dr. Slim team, and they've got a lot of magic going on there. So the question was really like, what is Docker Slim? How is it able to increase or decrease the size of your images, and why does Docker not have such an optimization built in? Docker is sort of unopinionated when it comes to how you build your image and what you put in it. So what the Docker Slim team is doing is they are applying opinions, right? They are looking in your image and they're making decisions about what they think should or shouldn't be there. And they're applying a bunch of intelligence, and it's very specific to each programming language and framework. So Docker is not going to do that, right? Like, at least not currently. It doesn't do anything like that. It doesn't look at your image and take stuff out, right? But that's what Docker Slim does, and that team and that company is sort of building an entire suite of products around how to analyze your image, find the parts that it doesn't think you need, and then even give you a config file that's separate from the Docker file for how you might protect. Like, you want to make sure that it doesn't remove certain parts, or other parts are okay to remove. And so they do a bunch of stuff there, right? It's actually pretty fancy. But I have a whole show on that YouTube, so just look up Docker Slim and Bret Fisher on YouTube. You'll probably find it. So
Awesome. Yeah, slim ai team is good. I like Kyle and Ivan. I know them very well. Have been checking their stuff since a long time. So I actually did the stream last time with last year, I believe, with Kyle on Docker Slim. It's pretty cool project, and even Slim AI is pretty dope stuff. So they have the Docker extension as well that you can try right away if you have Docker Desktop installed, and if not, then why? You should definitely have that installed. Thanks, Brett and Nuno, for this amazing space, dropping amazing knowledge, and yeah, um, Nuno, you would like to conclude and
Yeah,
say anything?
yeah. So thanks a lot. I'm following since some time now, but thanks for creating Cube Simplify. At the end of the day, I think it's for the community, created by the best. So anyone who, if you're not ambassador, or if you want to become an ambassador, uh, just one thing, and that's more a life advice here from a Portuguese guy, but it's like take your time, learn, and then you will grow. Okay, don't assume you know everything, or don't assume that someone that is writing something like a blog started knowing everything. I mean, Brett is a captain, like legendary captain, even, and I will use always this term, but he's around in tech for many decades, maybe. And for Docker,
Yes, yes, I'm old. I'm old. Yeah.
and for Docker, he was there like almost since day one. We are talking 2013, 2014, 2015 timeframes, right? It's not like Brett did his courses and started to learn yesterday or last week. So knowledge comes with time. So take your time to grow, and initiatives like Cube Simplify actually will help you grow in a more sane way. And again, don't hesitate to ask questions. Indeed, like I'm always like the guy who will ask what you would say like the dumb question. At the end of the day, I learned that people like Siam, Brett, others in the community will answer you. If you are like asking a true question, you don't know, just ask. Try to not repeat 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the same question. Try to learn, but at the same time, sometimes you cannot learn. So, like by yourself, you need some advice, and that's where like this community will help you. So, yeah, thank you.
Totally agree with all that. What he said.
What is it?
Yeah, thank you, Brett and Nuno, and thanks, Anurag, for hosting the space, and the person behind Cube Simplify, Pavan, as well. So, thank you, everyone, for today's space, and we'll close it for the day, and see you in the next one.
Yeah, thanks for hosting. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
See
you.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Yep. Bye bye, everyone.